What if the last voice to hear Adolf Hitler's final orders wasn't a general, a spy, or even a Nazi leader, but a simple telephone operator? Deep underground, as Berlin crumbled and the Third Reich collapsed, Rochus Misch sat at his switchboard in the Führerbunker, listening as power, lies, and an entire ideology died in silence. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't a decision-maker. Yet from his console he witnessed it all. The paranoia, the suicides, the burning of Hitler's body, and the murder of the Goebbels children. For decades, Misch carried the unbearable weight of being the last man to see and hear the fall of the Reich from inside. This is his story, raw, unfiltered, the chilling testimony of Hitler's last witness. Underground, Hitler's last operator. While Berlin burned and the Third Reich collapsed, a man held a telephone in the heart of hell. Rochus Misch was neither a general nor a strategist. He was Hitler's last operator, a silent witness to the final days of the regime. From his console in the Führerbunker, he saw power pass, heard the silence of defeat, and witnessed, without intervening, the death of a dictator and the ritual execution of an entire ideology. This is his story, intimate, raw, and disturbing. My new boss, Adolf Hitler. The image the Nazi regime projected to the world was not accidental. Everything in the Third Reich, from architecture to uniforms, from mass choreographies to ritual greetings, was meticulously designed. Every element had to reinforce the idea of order, purity, and authority. The body that best embodied this aesthetic was the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's personal guard. This was not just another unit, it was a living symbol of the regime. Selection was based not only on combat ability but also on height, posture, even facial features. Guards were meant to represent the Reich as much as to protect it. Rochus Misch never dreamed of belonging to that world. Born in 1917 to a humble family in Silesia, he lost his father in World War I, his mother in 1919, and his brother in a drowning accident. Raised by his grandparents, he grew up without family photos, without roots, without identity. As a teenager, he worked as an apprentice painter and decorator, standing out as a draftsman. Thanks to a scholarship, he studied at the Fine Arts School in Cologne. Misch loved sports, drawing, and women. He wasn't political, he wanted a life in design or advertising. But Germany in 1937 was a militarized nation, and like all young men, Misch was drafted. At Offenburg Station during medical exams, he saw a table with SS recruiters. They offered him an alternative. Instead of ordinary service and Reich labor duty, he could enlist in the Waffen-SS, an expanding elite force that promised better careers after service. Misch and his friend Hermann signed without grasping the weight of the commitment. In Munich, Misch's 1.85-meter height drew attention. Out of 139 recruits, only 12 were chosen for the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. He was one of them. On October 1, 1937, Misch joined the 5th Company of the Leibstandarte in Berlin. Training was relentless physically, but surprisingly light in military matters. Daily life was dominated by athletics, boxing, swimming, climbing. Among his comrades were Olympic medalists from the 1936 Games. Misch excelled in the 400 meters. They were being shaped to look good, to parade, to accompany Hitler in photographs, not to fight. He adapted. He never joined the Nazi Party. He listened to ideological lectures without devotion. My task was simply to be, he would later say. Being in the Leibstandarte meant obeying, not questioning. In 1938, Misch took part in his first action, the Anschluss in Austria. Crowds welcomed German troops with flowers and cheers. The same happened in the Sudetenland. Soldiers were housed in convents, danced, played mandolins, tried new foods. It felt like theater. War was still only a rumor. That changed in September 1939 during the Polish campaign, Misch's first true combat. During a field crossing, artillery shrapnel tore into him, shattering his chest. He was evacuated, operated on, and began recovery. Just as he was ready to return to the front, a new order came. Report to the Reich Chancellery. His commander had proposed him for a special post. Someone quiet, obedient, discreet, someone invisible. On May 6, 1940, Misch officially became a messenger, telephone operator, and member of Hitler's personal escort. Life changed instantly. He moved into the old Chancellery where Hitler still had private apartments. His main role was to operate Hitler's private telephone exchange, set up encrypted lines, and deliver messages. He didn't give orders, he didn't attend strategy meetings, he pressed buttons, carried papers, and stayed present. And presence was everything. Misch lived where Hitler lived. He shared the armored walls, the silent telephones, the corridors where Himmler, Göring, Goebbels, Bormann, and Ribbentrop passed with measured steps and muted greetings. His rule was to be invisible, to hear without listening, to see without looking. That was why he stayed close so long. Hitler's private quarters inside the Chancellery were surprisingly modest. A workroom, a bedroom, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. A long table, heavy chairs, desks, and a carpet that swallowed footsteps. It was here in the quiet heart of power that Misch spent the war, watching, listening, never speaking. A portrait of Frederick the Great hung on the wall. Here, Hitler spent most of his time, especially after 1941, as his health began a slow decline. To Misch, the man behind the myth was methodical, obsessively organized, bound to inflexible routines. Breakfast came late. Short, measured steps in the hallway. Records on the gramophone. Reports read and annotated. Letters dictated in a low, controlled voice. He almost never shouted. Misch saw him every day, not as a confidant, not even as a close subordinate, but as part of the permanent scenery. He greeted him in passing, delivered documents, carried messages. Sometimes he accompanied him to the private cinema or the inner garden. When Misch briefly fell ill, Hitler ordered Dr. Morell to examine him. When Misch married, a courier arrived with 2 boxes of French wine and a gift of 100,000 Reichsmarks. Hitler's initiative, not requested. To Misch, it signaled a boss who looked after his people. This proximity shaped his perception. In Misch's memory, Hitler was attentive, polite, even affable. He never heard him break into rants. He never heard him talk about Jews. He never witnessed racist tirades or criminal orders. His view was the one available from the antechamber. The dictator as a quiet, introspective man fond of night walks, romantic films, and afternoon tea. The bunker's architecture of power reinforced that partial truth. Decisions moved through sealed corridors. Misch had no access to the great tables where maps were unrolled and fates decided. He connected calls. He didn't frame the orders that traveled over them. Sometimes the facade cracked into domesticity. Once, carrying a message into a private room, he found Eva Braun in a nightgown. She pressed a finger to her lips, silence, and that was that. No scandal, no reprimand. To Misch, Eva was cheerful, youthful, lively, skating in the garden, playing with her dogs, joking with staff. He never heard her join political talk. In his off hours, he escaped to a workers' neighborhood to visit his wife Gerda and her parents. His father-in-law, once USPD, detested the regime. Politics were never discussed openly. The bond remained close. Home was a refuge where only silence about his work was required. When Hitler left Berlin, the whole apparatus moved with him. Misch went too, on the Führerbunker der Zug, or to the Berghof at Obersalzberg, or to the Wolfschanze in East Prussia. At each site, he built the same nervous system. Switchboards, encrypted lines, tested circuits, first to arrive, last to leave, sleeping on a cot beside the equipment. It was drudgery and a kind of insurance. Those who wired phones did not crawl through trenches, yet the air changed. From 1941 on, and more heavily across 1942 and 1943, the corridors grew quieter. Reports came darker. Meetings more closed. Bormann's presence hardened into command. Goebbels appeared more often. Optimism thinned. For operators like Misch, duty remained the same. The cables must work. The calls must go through. But the echo inside the wires was different. Some shocks burst through even the padded doors. In May 1941, Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland. Misch was on duty when the news hit. Hitler's reaction was cold, clipped. Surprise wrapped around iron. Erase Hess. His name was to vanish from documents, photographs, memoirs. Misch didn't know the backstory, only the magnitude of the rupture. He learned the cast by their edges. Goebbels, to staff, could be solicitous. Greetings, small talk, domestic queries. Bormann was distant and humorless. Morel, Hitler's physician, a man both relied upon and broadly despised. Through such men, guards moved like shadows, knowing when to appear and when to evaporate. Misch never sought more than his task. He did not consider himself a believer nor an official. He called himself a soldier on assignment. No guilt, no pride, only function. He stayed because he had been chosen and because he knew how to remain unseen. In these years, the Chancellery was not yet a fortress. Berlin had not suffered its worst raids. The Führer traveled, the hallways still filled with visitors. But the next phase was forming in the grain of the concrete, a phase in which the war would come home to the heart of power, a phase where the phone would carry the word Stalingrad, a phase in which routine would crack, and for the first time the operators would hear the echo of defeat, the beginning of the fall. War pulled Hitler out of Berlin. The Reich could no longer be run from the Chancellery. Distance, communications, and the demand for direct control over front lines forced constant movement. The solution was the Führerbunker, Hitler's armored train, and a constellation of forward headquarters, the Führerhauptquartiere. Wherever Hitler established himself, the nervous system followed. Staff, adjutants, guards, and the men who made voices travel through copper. Among them, Rochus Misch. His job was to build the voice lines, encrypted exchanges linking Army High Command, the Luftwaffe, propaganda, ministries, and field headquarters. He went ahead, installed, tested, and stayed within earshot of the desk where history was authored in low tones. Then he waited, a few steps away, for the red light to blink. Often the setting was the Berghof in Obersalzberg, Hitler's alpine refuge. Misch remembered days that felt almost like holidays, clear mountain air, looser schedules. Eva Braun bicycled, arranged film nights, lay in the sun. Staff took walks, there were jokes, there was music. Once, Erwin Rommel sat beside Misch to show photos of the Afrikakorps. From the salon, a record played. Joseph Schmidt, the Jewish tenor. The paradox that the author of racial laws would listen to a banned voice passed without comment. Then the order to move would come, and the idol would fold into steel. The Führerbunker, Hitler named it America, was power on rails. 15 cars, one armored, a conference coach, a security coach, a communications coach, Hitler's own car, staff sleepers, kitchen, radio center. Departures from Grunewald or Bad Godesberg moved under total security. The train carried not only a head of state but a portable headquarters, capable of issuing orders across a continent that was, by then, beginning to resist. Routes were sealed, stations evacuated, entire districts placed under watch. For kilometers around, a perimeter of secrecy and steel surrounded the Führer's special train. No timetable was made public, no movement announced. The convoy traveled under constant air escort, a ghost sliding across occupied Europe. On board, silence ruled. Hitler spent long hours in his private compartment, occasionally pacing the corridor, nodding brief greetings, or meeting with Keitel and Jodl in the conference car. Sometimes, in defiance of his own cultivated image, he stepped out onto the narrow platform between wagons to smoke in secret. In front of staff, he never lit a cigarette. Misch sat in his small cubicle by the communications car, hands on the switchboard, ears bent toward the hum of lines that stretched back to Berlin, to the Wehrmacht, to the Kriegsmarine. He slept little, catching only fragments of rest. Each time the train halted, he was among the first out, scouting the station, stringing cables, preparing temporary connections before Hitler emerged. One of the most frequent destinations was the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, near Rastenburg in East Prussia. Built in secrecy in 1940, the headquarters lay buried in a sea of pine forest, camouflaged, surrounded by minefields and concentric rings of barbed wire and watchtowers. Inside, bunkers of concrete more than 2 meters thick formed a city without windows. It was damp, dark, claustrophobic. Misch worked in a sealed room, hour after hour connecting calls to the Eastern Front. Some days he never saw sunlight. Life at the Wolfschanze followed an oppressive rhythm. Hitler rose late, breakfasted near noon, lunched in the afternoon, dined at midnight. Endless meetings with his generals filled the hours in between. Misch, always nearby, heard fragments, numbers, losses, positions, but never the whole picture. Yet even through broken sentences, he sensed the change. Reports no longer spoke of advances. They spoke of consolidations, retreats, casualties counted by the thousand. A word repeated itself more and more: Stalingrad. What in 1941 had seemed a straight road to victory by 1942 had become a swamp. Misch remembered one evening when Eva Braun arranged a film showing in the underground cinema. A light comedy flickered on the screen. Hitler chuckled twice, then stood and left in silence. The next morning, reports arrived from the Caucasus. German spearheads were stalled on the Volga. That same day, Misch patched through a call to Army Group South. The officer's voice on the other end was tense, firm, not fearful, but confident. For the first time, the enemy's tone carried weight. Something was shifting. In the winter of 1942, Misch was granted leave to marry Gerda. Upon returning, Hitler greeted him with unusual warmth, asked about the ceremony, and days later sent 2 boxes of wine as a gift. To Misch, this kindness contradicted the monstrous image painted abroad. No one who gives wine can be a demon, he thought, but already the circle of defeat was tightening. By 1943, Hitler moved deeper into the front, relocating to the Werwolf headquarters near Vinnytsia in Ukraine. The journey was long and dangerous. Soviet partisans prowled the forests, derailed trains, planted mines. The Führer's entourage shrank into a nervous core. Guard lines thickened. Misch slept with a pistol within reach. Explosions rattled in the night. Gunfire cracked at the edge of the compound. For the first time, the war was no longer distant. It pressed against the concrete. Here, Hitler's mood darkened. He grew irritable, suspicious. Bormann's authority expanded until it seemed absolute. Goebbels appeared more often, his speeches harsher, his presence more insistent. Conversations drifted toward betrayal, leaks, failures. No one admitted defeat aloud, but silence between words spoke otherwise. Misch kept working. He laid cables, switched calls, wrote nothing down. But his memory caught fragments. Hitler's ashen face after a conference, Keitel emerging pale and wordless. The urgency in officers' voices carried across fragile wires. The collapse had not yet reached Berlin, but in the forests of Ukraine, in the damp tunnels, in the taut threads of copper, defeat was already audible. Eventually the order came: return. The America train set off again. The Berghof was left behind, the Wolfschanze abandoned. Both places already smelled of failure. The bunker air grew heavier with each day. Paranoia clung to every wall, every whispered word. Hitler spoke in a monotone, his voice flat, drained of the fire it once carried. At times he grew agitated, especially when the names Göring and Himmler were mentioned, men he now spat out as traitors for daring to seek negotiations with the Allies. Goebbels retreated into propaganda, drafting heroic communiques even as his children slept in the room beside him. Eva Braun tried to chase away despair with small impromptu performances. The secretaries played cards, forcing nervous laughter into the silence. Meals were cooked on a small electric stove, rations divided carefully, and always the telephone rang. Frontline reports, Luftwaffe fragments, remnants of the general staff, each call bearing news more disastrous than the last. By the final days of April, the Soviets were barely 3 kilometers away. The ground above shook with the concussion of artillery shells falling near the Tiergarten and the Anhalter station. On April 25th, Berlin was completely cut off. There would be no escape. From that moment, the bunker ceased to be a command post and became only a tomb in waiting. Hitler refused to flee. He ordered documents burned. He dictated how his body should be destroyed. Still, he signed telegrams, still issued promotions, still clung to routines as the walls closed in. Misch remembered the details with clarity. On April 27th, the last encrypted connection with the Western Wehrmacht was severed. Radios failed soon after. The switchboard remained alive, but there was no one left to answer. Only internal lines worked now, linking bunker to bunker, propaganda to Chancellery, officers to secretaries. Beyond that, silence. The pressure in those narrow corridors was unbearable. Misch and another technician, Hannes, whispered of Gestapo executions, half convinced they would be shot to prevent leaks. Others muttered that Bormann might order the entire complex blown up, sealing every life beneath the rubble. Fear was no longer about losing. It was about how the end would come. Yet ritual continued. Hitler still lunched with his inner circle. Eva Braun dressed each day with meticulous care. Secretaries stuck to their routines. They whispered, they wrote, they pretended normality. But the hollowness in their eyes betrayed them. The smell of sweat and stale air clung to every room. Clothes were unchanged, faces pale. The end was no longer an idea. It was a presence in the walls, in the dim lights, in the shallow breaths of those who waited. On April 30th, just before 3:30 p.m., the sound came. A single sharp shot, unmistakable, echoing through the reinforced corridors. Otto Gunsche emerged pale, his face hardened. Hitler and Eva Braun were dead. From the communications room, Misch heard the whispered confirmation, "Der Führer ist tot." The boss is dead. That morning had dawned with a ghostly stillness over Berlin. The city reduced to rubble and flame. Beneath the ruins, the Führerbunker still stood, stubborn and silent. For 11 days, the Soviets had fought street by street, closing in. Now the heart of the Reich was a crater wrapped in smoke and fire. Inside, life continued mechanically, as though discipline and ritual could shield them from collapse. Misch remained at his post, the last operator of the regime's telephones, but the lines had all but died. Only connections within the underground maze remained. Führerbunker to Chancellery, Chancellery to the medical wing. Beyond that, silence. The day before, Hitler had dictated his testament, condemning Göring and Himmler as traitors, naming Dönitz as his successor. He had ordered the execution of Hermann Fegelein, Eva Braun's own brother-in-law, shot for attempting to flee. His every gesture in those final hours carried ritual weight, as if each act were part of a ceremony closing the circle. By midday on the 30th, he said farewell to his inner circle. Goebbels, Bormann, Krebs, Bergdorf, his secretaries Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian. He spoke quietly, neutrally, gave simple orders. There were no tears, no protest. Everyone knew what was coming. At 2:30, he withdrew to his room with Eva Braun. The door closed. At 3:30, the shot cracked. When they opened the room, Hitler was slumped on the sofa, a pistol still in his hand. Blood soaked the rug. His face was shattered from the temple. Beside him, Eva Braun lay motionless, cyanide on her lips. Orders had been left. The bodies must not fall into Soviet hands. Wrapped in blankets, carried up through the ruined corridors, they were taken to the garden of the Chancellery. Shells burst nearby as gasoline was poured over them. The first attempts to ignite failed. The rain, the damp earth resisted. Towels were lit, newspapers burned. At last, flames licked upward. The smoke curled into the gray Berlin sky. Misch smelled it even from the communications room. The Reich ended in smoke and ash. Below, no one spoke. Goebbels assumed the role of chancellor, but it was a formality without meaning. There was no Reich to govern, no armies left to command. Bormann still whispered of evacuation, but the Soviets already pressed against the Spree. In the bunker, secretaries continued to write letters that would never be sent. The lights still worked, the phones still hummed, but it was all a hollow stage set, the last act of a dead empire. That night, when Hitler's body was nothing but charred remains, Gunsche and the others went back into the smoking garden. They doused the blackened bundle with gasoline again, shifted it with gloved hands, raked at the embers. There was no ceremony and no prayer. Only the stubborn hiss of fuel on wet rubble and a ribbon of smoke climbing into the broken sky. Inside, Rochus Misch still tended the switchboard, answering straggling calls from units that no longer existed. Could he raise the Ministry of Propaganda? Was the line to Vienna alive? The answers faded into uselessness. Vienna was gone, the circuits dead. What remained on the board were echoes, lamps flickering, needles dipping, an apparatus moving on the inertia of habit. At some point, the bunker reached a deeper silence, the kind that swallows even whispered orders. Demoralized men argued in half-breathed phrases, some to run west, some to surrender, a few to end it themselves. Above, the Red Army hammered the district. The concrete trembled, the generator coughed and dimmed. In his corner of cables, Misch learned how the end sounded. Not a grand detonation, but a slow unthreading, one line after another going still. In the early hours of May 1st, the last voice on the wire asked almost gently, "Is it true? Is the Führer dead?" Misch didn't answer. He set the plug back into its cradle and understood without words that the world he had served for 5 years had slipped away. What they did with the remains, where exactly they sank the last shovelfuls of earth, no one would later agree to say. Bormann wouldn't reveal it. Goebbels wouldn't speak of it. Gunshot never clarified. Silence settled like ash, chosen and shared. By then, the machinery of power had come apart in front of its last witnesses. Misch, who had arrived as a young operator in 1940, was the only original hand left at his post. He commanded nothing and carried no weapon, but he had been there. The shot through a door, a face scorched by flame, a line that stopped ringing. Those were the last breaths of the Reich. There was still one act left. After Hitler's death, the bunker sagged into a sinister calm, as though his absence had drained the last current of resistance. In the lamp-lit corridors, the air was heavy with damp and resignation. Misch, listening to the hush between rings, felt gestures change. Fewer arguments, fewer furtive plans. Suicide settled into the room like another order to be carried out. Joseph Goebbels stepped into the empty space where leadership should have been. A title without a state, an office without a roof. He paced with frightening composure, issuing final instructions in a voice scrubbed of doubt. But his course had been chosen long before. If the Führer had died, he would follow. He had repeated it for years. His life had no meaning without the man now reduced to smoke. What neither oath nor title could contain was the decision that came next. Goebbels would not go alone. Magda, his wife, had brought their 6 children into the bunker on April 22nd, shepherding them into a carefully tended pocket of normalcy. Dolls, magazines, whispered bedtime stories. Misch sometimes heard their laughter float down the stairwell. An impossible sound in that place, like a spring bursting from stone. Yet everyone knew it could not last. Magda's devotion had the severity of faith. Her children would not live in the world that came after. They would not be paraded as trophies of defeat. On May 1st, Magda and Goebbels consulted again with Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger about poison. The questions were technical, almost clinical: dosage, timing, certainty. Misch didn't hear the exchanges, but he watched the doctor's measured steps, Magda's fixed expression, and understood. Cyanide capsules were prepared. No one passed a judgment aloud. Those who knew stayed quiet. Those who guessed looked away. Around 8 that evening, the final ritual began. One by one, the children were led to their beds. Magda sweetened the syrup that would draw them down into sleep. The nanny tucked blankets, smoothed hair. Helga, the eldest, balked. Why medicine if she wasn't ill? Magda stroked her face and said it would help her sleep well. Doubt flickered in the girl's eyes, then faded under the draft. When all 6 were breathing gently, Magda and the doctor went room to room. Who placed the capsules, mother or physician, would blur in later testimonies. What remained certain was the stillness that followed. 6 small bodies gone quiet in a room of dolls and folded clothes. Misch did not witness it directly. He learned of it in the face of a secretary who could not meet his gaze, and in the hush that fell over the upper level like a pall. No tears, no verdicts. Death, by then, had become an administrative act. Magda and Joseph Goebbels said their farewells. They climbed the ruined steps to the garden, escorted by 2 soldiers. Her hair was pinned, her dress sober. He walked as though reading from a script he had always known by heart. Outside there was a short interval, then the end. Some would later say they shot themselves. Others that poison did the work. Their bodies took flame, but not completely. The Soviets would find them soon enough. Below, Misch logged the last calls, the last thin threads of a broken web. Bormann disappeared. Stumpfegger dissolved into the tunnels. The secretaries whispered prayers that sounded like sleep. Air grew thick with the smell of burnt cloth and oil. Only ashes remained and a handful of men whom history had not planned to spare. What was done to the Goebbels children marked Misch more than any voice on any line. Decades later, he would still turn his head at the mention, words failing him where silence had first been learned. He only said, "I knew. We all knew, and no one did anything." In that single sentence lay not just the horror of the act, but the guilt of inertia, of those who stood in the bunker and watched as not only a regime, but all semblance of humanity collapsed with it. The children's room remained untouched. Toys scattered on the floor, books left open, a half-empty bottle of syrup on the table. The silence they left behind was more unbearable than the shelling overhead. No one wanted to go inside again. No one dared to touch a thing. It became the last altar of a twisted devotion, the final offering to fanaticism. From then on, the bunker felt inhabited only by ghosts. Rochus Misch, the unwilling witness, knew there were still hours of fire and confinement ahead. But he also knew that what had happened that night, the killing of the Goebbels children, was the absolute bottom. Nothing else, no shell or explosion, could compare. On May 2nd, the Soviets finally entered the bunker. Misch was still alive, still at his post, but those who could give him orders no longer existed. The air carried the sour stench of gunpowder, smoke, and death. Berlin had become rubble, and hell was a damp basement in the heart of a ruined city. After the war, Misch lived almost 6 more decades in the shadow of that basement. He was the last witness to Hitler's final days, captured, interrogated, and kept in Soviet prisons until 1953. The Soviets pressed him for every detail: how Hitler died, where his body was, who was present. Misch repeated the same account all his life. Hitler and Eva Braun had not escaped. I saw him go into the room, I heard the shot, I saw the body carried out. When he returned to West Berlin, his wife had remarried, believing him dead. His daughter barely remembered him. He rebuilt his life quietly as a decorator, avoiding the press until the 1970s. Later, he became a sought-after interviewee, his testimony both valued as a unique primary source and criticized for its lack of remorse. Misch never denied his service in the SS, never renounced his past, never openly condemned Hitler. He described him simply as "my boss," polite, disciplined, sometimes melancholy. He avoided speaking of the Holocaust, claiming it was not his concern. To some, his words humanized Hitler unnecessarily. To others, they were the flat, unfiltered account of a man who had seen history from the inside, but chose silence over judgment. He dismissed the myths of Hitler's supposed escape to Argentina or elsewhere as nonsense. For Misch, denying Hitler's suicide was just a way to deny responsibility. His memoir, I Was Hitler's Telephonist, Courier, and Bodyguard, published late in life, was neither an apology nor a condemnation. It was spare, factual, and unsettling in its lack of emotion. On September 5, 2013, Rochus Misch died in Berlin at the age of 96, the last surviving member of Hitler's inner circle. In his final interviews, when asked if he would have chosen differently, he answered, "I was a soldier. There was no option. I was part of history even though I didn't ask for it." And so, without remorse or vindication, the man who once held the telephone in the heart of hell closed his eyes. What he had heard, what he had seen, and what he never said remained buried among the echoes of the bunker.